The sun was sinking behind the empty plains when a lone girl moved across the dust. Her steps dragged as if the land itself pulled her down. Her feet were bare, split from heat and stones. Hunger twisted through her stomach. She had no food, no shoes, and no family left. Anyone seeing her might have believed she had reached the end of her strength and maybe her life. Far off, a man on a chestnut horse watched her stumble. He sat tall and still in the saddle, the brim of his hat hiding most of his face. He said nothing. He made no move to call out, yet something in his calm stare carried a strange promise. It was the kind of promise a dying soul might cling to. Her name was Elizabeth McNeel, but most folks once called her Lizzy. She had grown up on a small farm outside Fort Collins. Her life had been simple until sickness swept through her home and took her parents within days. At 19, she stood alone in the world, with only a worn sack on her shoulder and a small locket that held her mother's picture. That locket was the only piece of her old life she could still hold. She spent months wandering from one dusty road to another. Some nights she slept under thorny trees. Other nights she curled up in abandoned fields with only the wind to keep her company. She begged for scraps in small towns, but most people looked past her. Her boots fell apart from the long miles, and soon she walked barefoot over hot sand and sharp gravel. Every step cut into her skin. Her body grew thin from days without real food, but she kept moving because stopping meant dying. When she reached the plains of Wyoming, her feet bled with every step. The sky that evening glowed in shades of red and gold. She lifted her head for one last look at the world, and that was when she saw him, a lone cowboy on a chestnut horse. His coat was dusty. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes. He sat so still that for a moment she wondered if he was real or something her mind created from exhaustion. Lizzy tried to walk toward him, but her legs buckled. She fell face first into the gravel. Darkness swept over her like a blanket. When she opened her eyes again, she heard the slow thump of hooves and felt the crunch of dirt under her cheek. She sensed someone close. She lifted her head enough to see a tall figure kneeling beside her. He held out a hand. She hesitated only a moment before taking it because fear no longer mattered. Her body was too weak to refuse help. He pulled her to her feet and lifted her onto his horse. He did not speak. He did not explain. He simply held the reins and began to ride under the growing starlight. Lizzy lay against the saddle, drifting in and out of sleep as the horse moved in a slow, careful rhythm. She wondered if she was being carried towards safety or danger. Her mind was too tired to decide. When she woke again, she was lying in a small bed that smelled of hay and soap. A warm lamp glowed on a small table. The room was plain but clean. She sat up slowly, her head pounding. A man sat at the foot of the bed. The same man who had lifted her from the dirt. His hat rested on his knee. Gray touched his hair. His eyes were steady and calm. He handed her a cup of water. She drank until her throat no longer burned. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She managed only a few broken words of thanks. He nodded. Then he touched his throat and drew a single line across it with his hand. In that moment, she understood. The rancher could not speak. Over the next days, Lizzy learned his name from an old letter she found on the kitchen table. John Steedman. Painted. Rock Ranch, Wyoming. She also learned he had once dealt with Wyatt, ERP. The name startled her. She had heard tales about him from travelers. If John had crossed paths with such men, the silent rancher might have carried more stories than he let show. John cared for her wounds with simple gestures. He left clean water by her bed. He changed the cloth on her blistered feet. He cooked meals of beans and bread and left them for her to eat alone. Not once did he try to speak or ask for anything. His silence felt strange at first, then oddly comforting. He gave her space but never left her unprotected. When her strength returned, Lizzy began exploring the small ranch. Painted Rock was modest. A small house, a weather-worn barn, fenced fields, and a corral with 4 restless Mustangs. She found a photograph of John in the barn loft, standing beside a woman with warm eyes. Both wore wedding bands. Lizzy felt sadness grip her chest. She guessed the woman was gone, and the sorrow in John's eyes made deeper sense. She swept floors. She washed dishes. She fed the horses. John neither asked nor stopped her. He simply worked alongside her from sunrise to sundown. Some days he left a small portion of bread for her on the table. It was his quiet way of saying he wished for her to stay. Weeks passed before trouble came. Trouble always found good men in the West. And on one afternoon in Pine Bluff, Lizzy saw the first shadow of danger fall across Painted Rock Ranch. And that was the day she realized John's silence hid more than sorrow. It hid an old enemy. The morning air in Pine Bluff carried a sharp bite, the kind that warned folks to watch their step and their company. Lizzy stood close to John as they walked down the uneven main road. She felt every stare from the townspeople, some curious, some cold, some simply nosy. Pine Bluff was a place where trouble walked beside nearly every man. They entered the general store, and John wrote a short list on a scrap of paper for the clerk. While he gathered flour and coffee, Lizzy wandered toward the bulletin board. One notice stopped her cold. The face belonged to a woman known across the West, Margaret Dillon, leader of the Copper Blood Gang, wanted for murder and robbery. They said her name like a curse along the frontier. A chill crawled down Lizzy's spine. She backed away from the poster, but the unease lingered. When they stepped outside, trouble waited for them. 4 rough-looking men leaned against the hitching post. Their boots were thick with mud. Their eyes were sharp and unfriendly. One man pushed off the post and stepped forward. He had a sharp jaw and a scar on his chin. Lizzy recognized him at once. Randall Avery. Folks whispered his name with disgust. "Still breathing, Steedman," Randall called with a crooked grin. John offered no reply. He walked past him with calm control. But Lizzy did not miss the tightness in John's jaw. They mounted the horse and rode away, though she felt Randall's eyes stabbing into their backs. She wanted to ask who he was and what he wanted, but she knew John would answer only in silence. On the ride back, Lizzy sensed a storm building inside John, a storm that had nothing to do with the sky overhead. In the following days, she noticed a change across the ranch. John spent several nights sleeping in the barn with a rifle near his bedroll. Some nights he paced the edges of the corral long after dark. Lizzy felt the pressure growing. Something was coming for them. Her fear deepened when she found a new letter addressed to John. It came from Dodge City, written by Wyatt ERP himself. She read the letter with shaking hands. Randall Avery was tied to the Copper Blood Gang. He wanted John's land, and he had bought John's debt from the bank, giving him a legal hold on Painted Rock Ranch. When John read the letter, his shoulders slumped. The truth weighed heavy. Lizzy realized he had carried this burden alone for far too long. That truth struck even harder when she found the old letters and records. John had borrowed money after his wife Helena died. He had struggled to keep the ranch going alone. But the debt had grown beyond reason. Randall Avery now held it in his grasp. Lizzy felt anger rise like a fire. John had saved her life. She refused to let him lose his home. Her anger turned into fear the day trouble arrived. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Dust trailed behind them. Randall Avery led the group. A sneer carved across his face. The men rode straight toward the barn. Lizzy stepped out of the corral, heart hammering. John emerged from the barn holding a hammer in one hand and a revolver on his hip. Randall dismounted with a swagger. "You owe me, Steedman," he said. "I got a claim that says this ranch is mine. You hand over the deed, and we let you walk out of here." John stood silent, unreadable. Lizzy felt her pulse throb in her throat. Randall's grin widened. "Not talking. Never talking. That's fine. Actions speak louder anyway." Before Lizzy could blink, Randall drew his pistol. The world froze. John moved first. A single gunshot blasted through the quiet. Sparks flew as the bullet knocked Randall's pistol clean out of his hand. The weapon clattered into the dust. The 2 men with Randall reached for their guns. John dove behind a wagon and fired again. One man dropped with a cry. The other scrambled behind a trough as bullets sliced through the air. Lizzy ducked behind the corral, trembling as gunfire tore through the ranch. She clutched the fence rail and prayed. Randall lunged for his weapon, but John aimed his revolver at his chest. Randall froze. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The air was thick with dust and rage. Then Lizzy stepped forward and whispered the only thing she could think of. "Let them go, please." If they killed Randall's men, the Copper Blood Gang would come down on them like a storm. She knew it. John held his stance for a long moment. Then he lowered the hammer. Randall gathered his wounded men and mounted his horse. He spat a hateful promise. "This isn't finished." Lizzy watched them gallop away until they vanished behind the hills. The silence that followed felt heavy. She feared it was the calm before something much worse. That night, Lizzy and John sat at the worn kitchen table, a single lantern casting long shadows around them. The house creaked in the wind. A sense of danger clung to every corner of the room. She asked him softly, "Is it true? Do they have a claim to this ranch?" John nodded and wrote a few words on paper. "After Helena died, I borrowed too much. Randall bought the debt cheap. He wants the land." Lizzy's heart broke for him. She placed her hand over his. "We will find a way." He signed 3 words in the air. "It is wrong." She squeezed his hand. "Then we fight it, and they would fight it." Even if it meant riding into danger. The next morning they rode for Dodge City. They needed help. They needed allies. They needed someone the Copper Blood Gang feared. They needed Wyatt, ERP, and neither Lizzy nor John knew it yet, but the journey ahead would lead them into a battle far more deadly than anything they had faced. Dodge City greeted them with noise, dust, and danger. Saloons spilled music into the street, cowboys argued near hitching posts, and wagons rattled past in every direction. Lizzy stayed close to John, overwhelmed by the crowded chaos. If Wyatt ERP lived anywhere, it made sense it would be here, in a place half tamed by law and half ruled by trouble. Inside the Long Branch Saloon, smoke curled through the air. Gamblers muttered over cards. Bartenders wiped down counters. John walked straight through the noise without hesitation. Lizzy followed his steady steps until he stopped in front of a tall man with a firm jaw and a thick mustache. "Wyatt, ERP." Wyatt looked up from his drink and studied John with a mixture of surprise and sadness. "Steedman," he said. "Didn't expect to see you again." Then he glanced at Lizzy. "What brings you two all the way from Wyoming?" Lizzy explained everything. Randall Avery, the debt, the gunfight, the Copper Blood Gang. Wyatt listened with a hard stare. Doc Holliday, thin and pale, leaned nearby and tapped ash from his cigar. Wyatt finally nodded. "That gang has gone too far. Margaret Dillon is dangerous. Avery's a fool for siding with her." He leaned forward. "But there might be a way to beat them. We need proof of fraud or proof he's working with outlaws." Doc added a quiet cough and a grin. "And if that fails, we settle it the old-fashioned way." Wyatt suggested gathering documents from the ranch while he worked to find a witness in Dodge City. With the plan set, John and Lizzy began their long ride home. When Painted Rock Ranch came into view, Lizzy felt her stomach twist. The barn door hung crooked. The house looked disturbed. Inside, everything was turned over. Barrels smashed, tools scattered, one Mustang missing. They had been searched. In the bedroom, Lizzy found her mother's locket on the floor. She pressed it to her chest with shaking hands. They had stolen the old loan papers. The evidence was gone. That night, sleep escaped them. John sat by the window with his rifle. Lizzy tried to fix what she could inside the house, sweeping broken glass and writing chairs. The ranch no longer felt safe. At dawn, the sound of a single horse cut through the quiet. Lizzy rushed to the window. A woman approached, calm and confident, red hair blowing under a black hat. 2 revolvers hung at her hips. Margaret Dillon. She stopped in the yard and called out, voice cold and steady. "John Steedman, I come with an offer." John stepped onto the porch, rifle resting against his leg. "Sell the ranch to Avery for half its worth," she said, "or we burn it down. You got 3 days." She tipped her hat with a smug grin and rode off. Lizzy felt the air leave her lungs. 3 days to lose everything or fight a gang known for killing anyone in their way. But help came sooner than expected. Later that afternoon, 2 riders appeared, Wyatt, ERP, and Doc Holliday. Wyatt slid off his horse and surveyed the ranch. "Looks like they were here. You 2 holding up." When Lizzy told him the documents were stolen, he nodded grimly. "Doesn't matter. I have a witness and a judge, ready to move fast. But we must survive long enough to present it." That night, they fortified Painted Rock. They boarded windows, stacked furniture into barricades, and set ammunition within reach. Rain clouds gathered on the horizon. The storm came slowly, like the West itself knew a showdown was coming. When dawn broke, the sky split open with rain and thunder. Lizzy stood at her post near John. The farmhouse rattled under the roar of wind. Lightning streaked across the sky, revealing dark shapes on the ridge. Riders, 7 or 8. Margaret Dillon led the pack. Randall Avery rode at her side, arm wrapped from the last gunfight but rage burning bright. Dillon shouted through the storm, "Last chance! Hand over the ranch!" John fired a warning shot. The battle erupted in an instant. Gunfire flashed through the storm. Bullets smashed into the house. Mud splashed under running feet. Wyatt fired from one window, Doc from another. John moved from post to post with sharp precision. Lizzy reloaded and shot from behind a cabinet, breath shaking each time she pulled the trigger. One outlaw tried to torch the barn. Wyatt shot the torch out of his hand. Another tried to slip behind the house. Lizzy caught him at the kitchen door and fired the shotgun. The blast sent him scrambling away. Rain mixed with sweat and fear. The ranch shook under the force of gunfire. In a sudden flash of lightning, Lizzy saw Randall Avery creeping toward a fallen log. She stepped outside, trying to get an angle. Her pistol trembled in her hands. He spotted her and raised his gun. Before either could fire, a shot cracked from the left. Wyatt hit Avery in the shoulder, knocking him back into the mud. Dillon roared with fury and charged forward on her horse. She aimed straight at Lizzy. Lizzy froze. The world narrowed. Hoofbeats thundered. The gun rose. Then another shot split the air. Dillon toppled from her saddle and hit the ground hard. Lizzy spun to see John standing in the rain, rifle still smoking. His face was cold as stone. With their leader down, the remaining outlaws broke and fled. Wyatt chased Avery, returning minutes later with him bound and defeated. Margaret Dillon lay breathing but beaten. The storm washed away the blood and dust, leaving the ranch wounded but standing. Wyatt placed a hand on John's shoulder. "It's over. We have enough witnesses to end this." And that promise held true. Weeks later, Wyatt returned with legal papers signed by Judge Kendall. The fraudulent claim was thrown out. Randall Avery and Margaret Dillon were charged in Dodge City. Painted Rock Ranch was safe once more. Lizzy and John rebuilt slowly. Fence posts replaced. Windows patched. The quiet returned. The ranch no longer felt haunted but alive. One evening, after the chores were done, they stood near the corral as the sun dipped low. John handed her a slip of paper. "Thank you for staying." Tears filled her eyes. "This is home," she whispered. John nodded, a soft smile warming his tired face. Years passed. Painted Rock became a safe haven for travelers. Children played in the yard. Horses ran freely across clean fields. Lizzy and John built a life together, not with many words, but with trust and care. The girl who once walked barefoot across the plains found a family, and the silent rancher who once lived alone found someone who understood his quiet strength. Painted Rock Ranch stood as a reminder that kindness can be stronger than fear, and even in the Wild West, mercy could change a destiny.